Hello and welcome to this session where we're going to review the API tester. So this is a method that you would use to test your application programming interfaces to ensure that it is working correctly in terms of the calls that you've created, but also in terms of the authentication that you might have applied. So typically an API spec will be given to you to access one of the systems that we've created. And with that API spec, you would go ahead and write the code on your enterprise side. And so to grant your enterprise or your company access to our system, you would create an application programming interface. So that will allow for information to be exchanged with the system and for you to receive the functionality from that system. So in the API that you've created, the first thing you'll want to do is create the login specification. So refer to the documentation that's been provided to you and create the login aspect. So let's first look at simply logging in so that your API has passed the first stage of its operation. Looking at the form here, we have the usual authentication details. So the user ID and password will be sent to your API. And then in terms of the results coming back from your API, you can choose to anonymize parts of that. So there may be selected fields that you don't want to be shown when it returns to this particular screen, because perhaps you're using it for presentation purposes, or if you're demonstrating your API to other people and you don't want to disclose any of that information, then you might want to switch on anonymization. And then if your API is expecting for the password that's being sent in with the authentication, if your API expects that the password will already be encrypted in some way, then you might want to switch on the encryption. So I'm not switching that on here. And then you also have to specify the URL for the gateway that you've created. So that will start typically with something like HTTPS. So I'm going to paste in the URL to the gateway I've created. Noting here I've masked it out for this presentation. And you see at the moment I haven't specified any authentication details. So if I click connect, it's going to fail. So it gives some kind of error message here. And in fact, even your URL, if you just haven't specified the right URL, that's going to give you some kind of error message there. So let's log in correctly. And I do want anonymization, so let's. And now you've made it past the first screen. So once you're past the login screen, then you know at least your login call is working correctly in your API. So once you get this screen, you've progressed to the next stage, which is looking at the calls that might be made to your API. And the specification for the system is shown here. And just to explain that first, of course, a system created by my company will have a set of instructions. It will expect data to be received in a specific way, and there will be calls for data in a specific way. So to use that system at your institution or your company, you have to be able to answer those calls correctly, after which the system will be able to work as it should. So this specification tells you what sorts of calls will be made and how those calls should be answered. So for example, here's a call, get institution ID, and that call will be made without any other parameters. So the input space tells you what other parameters would be part of that call. So here's a different call, and you can see the input space requires at least these three parameters before it can be answered correctly. So that's the input space. And then in terms of the output, we are also declaring here what attributes are expected in the response to that. So in other words, if we send a request to your API, then there must be a response from your API which will contain this attribute institution, and then within this container there must be a JSON object with code and label as attributes. And if we just go ahead and test that out, you can see here the call is made, and then the results that were received are shown here, code and label. So within this container of institution, we have a JSON object, code and label, and so it's working correctly. And if you look at the values there, of course, you've got some hashed values, and that's because when we logged in, we specified we wanted to switch on anonymization. So we can see the structure is working correctly, but we don't know exactly what the numbers are for this institution as yet. So that's one simple call. And let's choose another one. So get course results. And then in this case, you can see our input space now. We've got a little form for specifying those values. So let's choose a course code here, and let's specify a year. And by the way, when you do this testing, you want to make sure that you provide enough detail here. Otherwise, you will send a request for data to your API which is too broad. So if I hadn't specified this year, then the API would go and search for all entries with this course. So it will return all the results for all time, for all years that this course was active. Or even worse, if I hadn't specified the course code at all, or the year, then the API would be requested to return all results in all courses in all years. And that might well slow down operations on your server side. So even during testing, you want to ensure that you've specified enough parameters in here that you receive results in a reasonable time and you're not obstructing operations elsewhere. And in fact, before issuing a test, before clicking on test, you might want to click view payload instead. And if you view payload, then it tells you what the request is going to be. So it's going to send a request to your API for called get course results, and then in the API or in the API gateway, you are going to interpret this and say, okay, for get course results, I need to refer to a specific table, and in that table, I need to look up this course code for this year. So you would write the code for undertaking this, for doing this correctly. So once that's specified, and if you've responded correctly, right? So as I said, you would go ahead and write the code that responds to that request, and then the result that comes back must be within the container. The container is results, so it must come back in the container results, and then in results it must be a series of rows, and those rows must have these columns, so student number, course code, and so on. And by the way, we've switched on anonymization, so it will hash the student number here. So that was just viewing the payload, so let's go ahead and test that. And so in the analysis, it says here, the call is working correctly, the result has a container, and that means it has the container results, which has these attributes, so student number, course code, and all of that. And you can scroll down here to see the raw results of that. So you can see here the student number is anonymized, but everything else is not anonymized. So the student result and all that is shown here. So so this call is working correctly. And so what you would do is progress through the list of all API calls, make sure each one is working properly, and then you'll be able to say, yes, your API is ready. And then you go over to the system and you apply that URL, that API gateway URL, and you'll have access to that system.